Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Morneau. COVID-19 has impacted all of our lives and has devastated New Mexico's state budget due to the drastic fall in oil and gas prices. Some environmental groups have said this is a moment when the country can take steps to seal abandoned oil and gas wells across the country. And they say depending on funding, unemployed oil and gas workers can help accomplish this. Joining us to learn more about this issue is Jon Goldstein. He is Director of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs for the Environmental Defense Fund. Jon is also a former Cabinet Secretary for New Mexico's Department of Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources. Jon, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me, Anthony.
Now, I want to start off. Your organization has called for funding to put unemployed oil and gas workers back to work, sealing abandoned mines in New Mexico. How do you propose this can happen?
Well, I mean, there are a number of issues that are front of mind for people right now. And one of the biggest ones is, the unemployment rate, right? There are a lot of folks that have been laid off, particularly in southern New Mexico. And one of the ways that we see that we could immediately put a good chunk of these workers back to work is if there was federal funding in place to plug orphan wells. These are wells that were no longer economic. The oil and gas producer walked away from them, left the state holding the bag. Unfortunately, the state doesn't have sufficient funding right now to get these things properly plugged and abandoned. And so some stimulus dollars, federal monies going into these states could plug these wells, put oil and gas workers back to work, pouring the concrete, getting them plugged, and also prevent environmental harm to groundwater and air from these wells that have just left to do their thing.
Now, you mentioned environmental harm. What type of environmental impact are we talking about with some of these wells?
Orphan wells can be sources of groundwater pollution. Most of the folks in New Mexico rely on underground aquifers for their drinking water, and these unplugged wells can leach pollution into groundwater, impacting drinking water supplies. They can also be sources of air pollution, allowing gases to escape, things that can accelerate climate change like methane, things that can have immediate health impacts like benzene. And so getting these things plugged right is important from an environmental perspective as well as a jobs perspective.
So how does that work where these mines don't get taken care of or sealed? Is it when a company perhaps goes under and moves out or decides to leave the area? What are the regulations regarding that make this system already happen?
That's right. So before an oil and gas company can drill a well in New Mexico, they have to have a bond that they put up with the state. And that bond is supposed to leave the state with sufficient resources that if that company goes belly up, the state can call on that bond and use that money to get the well plugged. Unfortunately, these bonding levels, both at the state and at the federal government, were set many decades ago and are not sufficient to plug these wells today. The dollars don't keep up with the costs that we see today to get these wells taken care of properly. And so there's both this need for an immediate tranche of money to get these things addressed, but there's also a need for some more systemic fixes to increase these bonding levels as we go forward.
Now, moving forward, I'd like to hear kind of how many mines are we talking about and wells are we talking about in the state regarding these wells? How many are we talking about?
I mean, at a minimum, I think the current estimates are 700 wells across New Mexico. Nationwide, it could be as many as 2 or 3 million wells.
Wow. That
are orphaned currently. And we expect that number to increase as this economy right now is tough for the oil and gas industry. And we expect there to be more of a shakeout, more companies maybe needing to cut costs and and walk away from some of these responsibilities. And so those numbers are probably going to increase, which is why we think it's important to address right now.
Okay, so you say like around 700 in New Mexico that we know of, nationwide 2 to 3 million possibly. Why such a high number? Was this something that wasn't being kept on record at a certain point in time?
It's a problem that's been going on for many, many decades. I mean, you have wells in the Permian Basin that were drilled 100 years ago. You have wells back east in Pennsylvania where the oil industry actually began in the 1800s. That are that old, were drilled and cased with wood, in some cases, not even with concrete. And so, yeah, it's a problem that's been going on for many, many decades that we need to get addressed. And I should mention too, it's not only environmental groups, I think, that are focused on this issue. It's the state regulators in Santa Fe. Adrian Sandoval, the head of the Oil Conservation Division, testified last week before a congressional committee about the need for this funding and supporting it. And also Representative Xochitl Torres-Small from right down in Las Cruces has been pushing to get this money, both as an environmental improvement project, but also as a way to create jobs for these laid off workers.
How is that federal funding looking now? What are your hopes in this actually being available to help seal some of these mines or wells in New Mexico?
I'm optimistic because it's not only something that Democrats like Xochitl Torres-Small and Ben Ray Lujan are pushing for, but also their Republican colleagues across the aisle are joining them in this effort. And so it's a bipartisan push in Congress right now, and I think that bodes well. As these stimulus talks continue, perhaps in July we might see another stimulus package go through Congress. And I think this is something that certainly a lot of folks are looking at as a key part of that.
Now, your group is proposing to have a sort of some incentives with this to respond to this. Can you kind of explain how you want to make this like an incentivized effort?
Yeah, I mentioned that there's an opportunity right now to get these wells plugged, but there's also the need for longer term changes to the way we bond these wells and the bonding levels so that we don't get in this problem again next time there's a crash. And so there's sort of two tranches of money that we've proposed. First, a tranche of money that would immediately go to states to begin this plugging work as quickly as possible. And then a second tranche of money that would be contingent upon trying to get some of these systems improved so that states that are doing well and that are beginning to improve the requirements on the oil and gas industry could get additional, shots in the arm, additional funding to keep doing the work.
How urgent of an issue do you think this is right now in New Mexico? Are there any certain parts of the state that you think that there are more severe issues where this needs to be addressed? Can you share with us your thoughts on that?
Well, I think right now, there are two main parts of New Mexico where oil and gas is produced. The southeast, the Permian Basin, and the northwest, the San Juan Basin. Right now, there are a lot of older wells, particularly in the San Juan Basin in northwest New Mexico, that I think could use some of this funding right away. As we go forward, I think there are going to be more and more wells in the Permian, depending upon what happens with the economics of the oil and gas industry, that could use this funding as well. So I think it's really an issue that's going to have some geographic diversity across New Mexico and be able to help different parts of the state.
What other industries do you think that this issue could impact if these abandoned wells aren't addressed?
Well, it's a big deal in New Mexico. The state under Governor Lujan Grisham is really trying to diversify the economy. And one of the big ways that they're trying to do that is through promoting outdoor recreation. Right down there in Las Cruces, the Oregon Mountains National Monument has been a big shot in the arm for outdoor recreation and promoting that clean industry in New Mexico. And so if we have hundreds of wells, maybe even thousands of wells that aren't plugged properly, that are creating air pollution, that are leading to the ozone problems that folks are starting to see in southeast New Mexico in particular, harms that outdoor rec industry. It makes it harder for the state to promote that as a place where people want to come and ride their mountain bikes or hike on the trails. And so, I think addressing this is going to help with that diversification as well.
What sort of chemicals are in these wells that could pollute the groundwater that we depend on so much here in New Mexico?
I mean, the hydrocarbons themselves, of course, the oil and the natural gas and the things that folks are going after are a problem. But also, it's the naturally occurring forms of pollution that just exist in these deep areas where the oil and gas is being extracted from. So you've got down there radioactive substances. You've got down there other forms of pollution that folks don't want to drink, that have health impacts. And so when you've got a straw that's been drilled down into the earth, it can allow, if it's not properly taken care of, it can allow those forms of pollution to migrate into the aquifer and then impact drinking water supplies.
Okay, so if it does end up in drinking water and people are consuming this, what sort of health impacts is it having?
It depends on the constituent. I mean, and I'm not saying that this is happening now. I'm saying that if you don't get these plugged and you don't take care of them properly, it can be a problem. And so it's an issue that, it's another reason why you want to get these wells plugged and taken care of in the proper way going forward.
I did some reporting in my early days as a cub reporter on the impact that some communities may face when the water systems aren't treated with care, when companies in the oil and gas industry decide to up and move. And I was really taken back by it. It was something that maybe it looked almost like abandoned towns where the country has had to buy out towns and create super funds. Do you think that's possible here in New Mexico?
I certainly hope not. I mean, there are cases of oil and gas pits, oil and gas wells that aren't taken care of properly, impacting water supplies. And it's a concern. I mean, there's nothing more important to the continued economic vitality and health of New Mexico than having clean, safe water supplies. And so it's certainly an issue that we want to see addressed. There's been a long and unfortunate history of some toxic legacies getting left behind, Superfund sites being created, uranium mines that don't get taken care of, things like that. And we don't want to see that happen in this case.
What are your thoughts on the current regulations in New Mexico regarding this issue? Now, I know you mentioned that they need to update these laws and rules with the bonds. Are there any other issues that you think need to be addressed when it comes to oil and gas, the oil and gas industry, and these abandoned wells?
Under Governor Lujan Grisham, the state's been doing a good job of trying to update a number of things when it comes to regulating the oil and gas industry. The first was reinstituting the ability for the main oil and gas regulator in the state to fine oil and gas companies that violate the rules that the state has put in place to protect its air and water. Believe it or not, for about a decade, the oil and gas regulator couldn't issue fines or penalties to oil and gas operators in New Mexico that were violating the rules. It's kind of crazy. It's like a traffic cop that can't write speeding tickets. And so under Governor Lujan Grisham, that was fixed. The legislature passed a bill to restore that enforcement authority to the oil and gas regulator, and they just went out and fined a produced water hauler down in southeast New Mexico for dumping that water illegally. Another thing I want to mention goes around methane emissions, and that's a big issue in New Mexico, and that's something else that the state under Governor Lujan Grisham is working on, doing state level rules to limit methane pollution and waste from oil and gas wells all across New Mexico.
So obviously we're in a recession. There are many people in New Mexico who are needing jobs right now. The oil and gas industry obviously has been hurt. So do you think this is a moment where there can be a bipartisan compromise, not only in the state, but at the federal level, to find funding for this to get folks back to work and also help the environment?
I do. I'm very optimistic about this opportunity right now. I mean, I think with the leadership of people like Representative Torres Small and Representative Lujan from New Mexico pushing this in the House, and Senators Udall and Heinrich are also very much on board with this effort. I'm very optimistic about the ability to get this through and to get this money to states to start to address this problem.
New Mexico obviously had some challenges rebounding from the last recession, the Great Recession. Now, with this current recession, how do you see this as an opportunity for the state to make some changes so that it can have a sustainable energy environment, energy industry?
I think the methane rules are one way. The oil and gas economy is one that's defined by booms and busts. We've seen the boom most recently just a few months ago, and now we're seeing the bust once again. This is not the first time we've witnessed this roller coaster ride. By putting in place things like methane rules that capture the methane that's currently being wasted, that allow the state to recoup tens of millions of dollars a year in revenue from that. I think that kind of helps smooth out some of those bumps. It's an industry, the methane mitigation industry, that needs to employ New Mexicans in good times and in bad. So these wild swings you see with virtually zero unemployment, and then a few months later, 14, 15% unemployment. With the methane mitigation industry and the guys going out to do the inspections on a regular basis, you see that kind of smoothed out a little bit. And you're taking the roller coaster and turning it into more of a locomotive, which just kind of chugs along. And so I see those as two big opportunities. And meanwhile, things like comprehensive action on climate, things that are very important to Governor Lujan Grisham and policies that she's pushing, are going to help transition the state to a cleaner economy as well.
We're in an election year. Obviously, that could determine what moves forward, what happens with a lot of these regulations in regards to passing possible legislation and achieving what you're proposing. I'm kind of curious, how do you see the political atmosphere right now with this issue? Do you think it is really bipartisan in New Mexico? Do you think that the economy being as bad as it is right now is going to motivate people to pursue this? Or do you think there's going to be some blowback saying that there isn't enough money? How are we going to fund this?
I think there's an opportunity now in New Mexico. I think people across the aisle do agree that there's a need for the state to diversify. There's a need for the state to create a more robust and resilient economy that really lifts up all the people of New Mexico better going forward. You see that in the rural areas with the wind industry, where some conservative, members of the state legislature are very strong advocates for wind energy because they see how it's a source of income for ranchers and eastern New Mexico. And I think you can see that more broadly, with the transition to a cleaner economy. I mean, nobody likes to live through this sort of boom and bust cycle. It's painful, and particularly painful for the workers that are doing fine one day and then not the next. And so I think that by working together, we can create a more sort of stable and resilient economy for New Mexico. It's going to take work, but I think that this is the time. We have an opportunity right now to begin to rebuild better and create that more just and robust system.
How do the jobs in, say, like building a wind economy or a solar economy compare to what you see in the oil and gas industry? I mean, the oil and gas industry employs many New Mexicans who, without a college degree, are making a lot of money. I mean, pushing six figures or more. How do the other industries compare to making that type of money?
I think the economic studies have shown that over the past few decades, clean energy has been one of the fastest growing sectors nationally for jobs and for economic impact. I think New Mexico has benefited from some of that. but more would be good. The methane mitigation industry that I mentioned before is another one where New Mexico's done okay in that industry. It's in the top 10 nationally, but it lags behind neighboring states like Colorado and Wyoming that have actually acted at the state level to put rules in place that help foster this industry and that help create these jobs. So it shows that there's more room to grow. That's something I see, the Lujan Grisham administration really focusing on and trying to diversify into those areas.
But do you think they can grow in the communities where the oil and gas industry is prevalent right now? Because with what you're proposing, I mean, is it guaranteed it's going to be in those communities? Because you're going to have a lot of folks who are very concerned about these jobs just up and leaving, and are they going to be forced to up and leave as well to work at a different part of the state?
Well, unfortunately, that's what we've witnessed for the past many, many decades with the oil and gas industry, right? Is, a lot of, during boom times, these man camps crop up and folks are coming from Texas and living in a trailer and, working out, drilling wells. And then when the prices change, they go away. I think with the methane mitigation industry, it's a little more stable. And we're talking about, jobs in manufacturing, say, when you're building the piece of equipment that doesn't leak as much. You want to build that close to the site. You want to have it installed by somebody that lives right there close to the site. And you want to have it inspected by somebody who lives right there close to the site because you're saving on all those costs. And so it's a little more rooted in the area in a town like Farmington, say, or in a town like Hobbs, where you're able to, kind of take these workers that know this industry, put them to work in manufacturing, put them to work in inspecting these sites and installing these pieces of equipment.
You're a former cabinet secretary dealing with the energy sector. What are your thoughts on moving forward in New Mexico and as far as the industry goes? Do you think that the industry can really handle this boom and bust timeline that we've seen so far, just even in the last decade?
I think that going forward, the oil and gas industry is going to need to continue to find ways to minimize its impact. And I mean that in terms of minimize its environmental impact, and particularly in regards to climate change. Nowhere in the country, I would say, is more imperiled by a changing, drier climate than New Mexico. It's really on the front lines of this issue. And particularly the natural gas industry has spent a lot of money and put a lot of effort into branding itself as a cleaner alternative to coal. Natural gas can have half of the climate impact of coal when it's burned on a per energy unit basis. The problem is if you're not capturing that methane, which is the primary component of natural gas, if you're just letting it escape and leak out, it can be actually a much more harmful pollutant for the climate than that carbon dioxide from the coal. And so it really needs to, the natural gas industry really needs to continue to drive down its methane emissions. Things like what the state of New Mexico is proposing to do with its state methane rules will certainly help. We're going to need to see a return to those sorts of rules at the federal level too. President Obama put in place some good rules in the late days of his administration. Those are in the process of being rolled back by the Trump administration. Like you mentioned, there's an election in November, so we'll see what happens there. But I think there could be an opportunity to get those federal methane rules back in place too, and continue to drive down the pollution impacts.
So let's say federal funding does come through with the amount that your organization thinks is needed to put unemployed oil and gas workers to work helping seal these wells. What type of timeline are we talking about to get people back to work and doing this?
One of the things we're interested in seeing happen is having the money go directly to the states, because we feel like that is going to be able to put those folks back to work quicker. Avoiding the federal bureaucracy and a lot of the red tape is a really important way that we think that we can get this money out into the oil field as quickly as possible to get these wells plugged. Folks like Adrian Sandoval at the Oil Conservation Division know the contractors, they know how to get this work done. And so we think folks like her and her colleagues across the oil and gas states can get this money spent quickly and get it spent right, so that it's having an immediate impact.
And we just have about a minute left, but what do you think is going to hold up this, or do you have any concerns?
I'm optimistic at this point. I think things are looking good. I never put too much money on anything Congress will or won't do. It's a bit of a wild card, but I think that of all the issues out there right now, it's nice to be working on one that seems to have bipartisan support.
All right, Jon Goldstein is Director of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs for the Environmental Defense Fund. Jon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Anthony. Great to talk to you.
And we want to thank you for joining us for Fronteras, Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. Don't forget, we're on social media. You can always like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to the KRWG Public Media, or I should say News YouTube channel. It's KRWG News on YouTube, where you can stay updated with programs like this. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.